I almost didn't answer the phone when it rang that afternoon, because I had only been in the house for less than 48 hours, and no one was supposed to have my number yet. But something about the way it kept ringing, slow and steady, like it knew I was standing right there in the kitchen pretending not to hear it, made me pick it up anyway. And the first thing the man said was, "I forgot to remove a camera. Come alone." And I remember smiling politely, even though he couldn't see me. Because at 67 you learn to respond to strange things with calm instead of panic. But there was something in his voice, something too casual, too rehearsed, that stayed with me long after the call ended. And I stood there in my new kitchen, sunlight falling across the marble countertop I had saved for nearly 2 years to afford, thinking about how this house was supposed to be my fresh start, my quiet place after Robert passed, a place where I could finally breathe without feeling like every room still belonged to someone who wasn't there anymore. And I told myself it was probably nothing, just an old man forgetting to uninstall some outdated security system. But even as I told myself that, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before, the way the living room felt just a little too arranged, like everything was exactly where it should be, but not where I had left it. And I walked slowly from the kitchen into the living room, my steps soft against the hardwood floor. And that's when I saw it, a tiny black dot near the corner of the wall, so small I would have missed it if the light hadn't hit it just right. And I moved closer, my heart not racing, just steady, observant, the way it gets when you start putting pieces together before you understand the full picture. And when I reached up and touched it, I realized it wasn't dust or a screw or anything harmless. It was warm, like it had been running recently. And I pulled my hand back slowly, not startled, just aware, because that's the word that fits best, aware that something about this house wasn't as simple as I had believed when I signed the papers, aware that the call I had just received wasn't a coincidence. And I stood there for a long moment, looking at that tiny lens, thinking about the man's words, "Come alone." And I found it interesting that he had assumed I would bring someone, because I hadn't planned to tell anyone about the call, not even my son, who had insisted I move closer to the city after Robert's passing, not even Emily, my daughter-in-law, who had been asking a lot of questions lately about my finances, about the sale of my old house, about how I planned to manage on my own, questions that felt caring on the surface but left a strange aftertaste, like there was something underneath them I couldn't quite name. And I walked over to the small desk in the corner where the previous owner had left a few things behind, nothing valuable, just a couple of cables, an old remote, and a small black device that I hadn't thought much about when I first saw it. But now, as I picked it up, I noticed the slot on the side, the kind you'd expect for a memory card. And I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the quiet importance of something that had been left behind not by accident, but intentionally. And I sat down slowly, the chair creaking softly beneath me. And for a moment, I just held the device, not rushing, not reacting, because I have learned that the truth reveals itself more clearly when you don't chase it. And I thought about the timeline, about how quickly the house had been put on the market, how eager the seller had been to close the deal, how little negotiation there had been. And at the time I had felt lucky, grateful even. But now, sitting there with that device in my hand and a warm camera in my wall, I began to see it differently, not as luck, but as something arranged, something prepared in advance. And I looked around the room again, this time not as a homeowner admiring her new space, but as someone stepping into a place that had been watching long before she arrived. And I wondered, not with fear, but with a quiet, steady curiosity, how long that camera had been there, how much it had seen, and more importantly, who had been watching, because houses hold memories, yes, but they can also hold intentions. And as I finally slid the memory card out of the device and held it between my fingers, I realized something that made me pause, not in shock, but in recognition, the kind that settles slowly in your chest, that this wasn't just about a forgotten camera, and it wasn't just about a careless former owner. This was about a story that had already begun before I ever walked through that front door. And somehow, without realizing it, I had stepped right into the middle of it. I did not play the footage right away, even though every instinct told me to, because there is a difference between curiosity and readiness. And I have learned that once you see something, you cannot pretend you did not. So I set the small device down on the desk and walked back into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip, letting the quiet of the house settle around me again. Except it did not feel like quiet anymore. It felt occupied, not in a physical sense, but in a way that made every sound more noticeable. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, even the soft creak of the floor as the house adjusted to the afternoon heat. And I found myself thinking about the last 2 years of my life, about how carefully I had planned this move, how I had sold the old house, packed away decades of memories into labeled boxes, and told myself that this was a new chapter, one where I would no longer feel like a guest in my own life. And yet here I was, standing in a house that already seemed to know more about me than I knew about it. And I realized then that the unease I felt was not fear, it was recognition, the kind that comes when something does not align with the story you have been telling yourself. And I set the glass down and walked back to the desk, picking up the device again, this time without hesitation, sliding the memory card into my laptop with steady hands. And for a brief moment the screen remained blank, just my reflection staring back at me, older than I felt inside, silver hair pulled back neatly, eyes that had seen enough of life to understand that nothing truly complicated ever begins in an obvious way. And then the files appeared, a long list of video clips, each labeled with a date and time, stretching back further than I expected, not just days, but weeks, even months. And that was the first moment something shifted inside me, because I had only owned this house for 2 days, which meant whatever had been recorded here had started long before I ever walked through that front door. And I clicked on the most recent file first, not out of urgency, but out of logic, and the video opened to a familiar view. My living room, the same angle as the camera I had just discovered, except this time I was in it, moving slowly across the frame, setting down a box, adjusting a picture frame, completely unaware that I was being watched, and I studied my own movements carefully, not with embarrassment, but with a kind of detached focus, noting the timestamp in the corner, noting the clarity of the image, the way it captured even the smallest details. And then I clicked on an earlier file, expecting to see an empty room, but instead I saw something that made me pause, not because it was shocking, but because it did not make sense. The room was not empty. It was occupied, not by me, but by someone else, a young woman moving through the space with confidence, opening cabinets, checking drawers, as if she belonged there. And I leaned closer to the screen, narrowing my eyes slightly, because there was something about the way she carried herself that felt familiar, something in the tilt of her head, the way she brushed her hair back as she moved. And it took me a few seconds longer than it should have to recognize her, not because she was a stranger, but because I had not expected to see her here, in this place, at this time. And when the realization settled in, it did so quietly, like a piece of a puzzle sliding into place without resistance. It was Emily, my daughter-in-law, and I sat back slowly, my hands resting on the edge of the desk, not gripping, not trembling, just still, because this was not a moment for reaction. This was a moment for understanding. And I let the video continue to play, watching as she moved through the house, occasionally glancing toward the camera as if she knew exactly where it was, as if she had nothing to hide from it. And I thought about the questions she had been asking me over the past few months, about my finances, about the sale of my old home, about whether I planned to downsize or invest, questions that had seemed practical at the time, even thoughtful, but now, in the light of this footage, took on a different meaning. And I clicked through more files, each one revealing another piece of the same quiet pattern. Emily in the house before it was sold. Emily speaking to someone off camera. Emily standing in the very room I was sitting in now. And I noticed something else, something even more subtle. The timestamps did not stop at the day I moved in. They continued, uninterrupted, as if the transition of ownership had not mattered at all to whoever had set this up. And I closed the laptop slowly, not because I had seen enough, but because I had seen enough for now, because there is a point where gathering more information does not give you more clarity. It only risks clouding the judgment you will need later. And I sat there in the quiet again, the house around me no longer feeling new, no longer feeling like a blank space waiting to be filled, but like a place with a history I had not been told, a history that had continued seamlessly into my presence. And I thought about the call, about the man's voice, about the way he had said come alone. And I realized that this was not an invitation, it was a test, and tests are only given when someone expects a certain kind of response. And I have never been the kind of person to respond exactly as expected, so I reached for my phone, not with urgency, but with intention, and I looked at the number that had called me earlier, memorizing it before pressing the button to call back. And as the line began to ring, steady and patient, I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not to calm myself, but to prepare, because whatever this was, whatever had been set in motion before I arrived, I was no longer just part of it. I was beginning to understand it, and understanding changes everything. I let the phone ring 3 times before he answered, not because I was unsure, but because timing matters more than people realize. And when he finally picked up, his voice was exactly the same as before, calm, measured, almost polite, as if we were discussing something ordinary instead of something that had already begun to unravel in ways neither of us had acknowledged out loud. And he said, "I was wondering when you would call back." And I found that interesting, not surprising, just interesting, because it confirmed what I had already suspected, that this was never about a forgotten camera. It was about seeing how long it would take me to notice, how long it would take me to respond. And I leaned back slightly in the chair, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk, and I said, "You left more than a camera behind." And there was a brief pause on the other end of the line, not long enough to be called hesitation, but long enough to be noticed, and then he exhaled softly, almost like someone acknowledging a move in a game they knew had already started, and he said, "Then you have seen it." And I did not answer right away, because silence has a way of making people fill in the spaces themselves, and after a moment he continued, "It is better if we speak in person." And I could hear something else in his tone now, something less controlled, not fear exactly, but urgency carefully contained, and I thought about the footage again, about Emily moving through this house as if she had a purpose here, about the timestamps that stretched back before the sale, about the way everything connected without ever being explained. And I said, "You told me to come alone." And he replied, "Yes," without hesitation, and I smiled slightly, not because I trusted him, but because I understood the structure of what he was trying to maintain, and I said, "Then tell me why." And for the first time his voice shifted, just slightly, as if he was choosing his words more carefully now, and he said, "Because if you bring anyone else, they will not let me say what you need to hear." And that was the moment I realized this was not just about information, it was about control, about who knew what, and who was allowed to say it. And I stood up slowly, walking toward the living room again, my eyes drifting back to the small lens in the wall, still quiet, still present. And I said, "You sold me this house." And he answered, "Yes," and I continued, "But you did not stop watching it." And there was no denial, no attempt to soften the statement, just a quiet, "No." And I appreciated that, not the situation, but the honesty, because it meant I was no longer dealing with assumptions. I was dealing with something real, something deliberate, and I stopped near the window, looking out at the empty street, the afternoon light stretching across the pavement, everything appearing so normal from the outside. And I said, "You knew I would find it." And he paused again, longer this time, and then said, "I hoped you would." And that word, hoped, stayed with me, because it suggested something different than what I had first imagined, not just manipulation, but intention with a purpose beyond simple surveillance. And I turned slightly, my reflection faintly visible in the glass, and I asked, "And Emily?" And this time the silence was unmistakable, not accidental, not thoughtful, but deliberate. And I waited, because there is no need to rush when the truth is already moving toward you. And finally he said, "She has been involved from the beginning." And I closed my eyes for just a second, not in disbelief, but in confirmation, because everything I had seen on that screen had already told me that, and hearing it spoken aloud did not change the facts, it only clarified them. And I opened my eyes again, steady, focused, and said, "Then this is not about the house." And he replied, "No." And I asked, "Then what is it about?" And his answer came slower this time, each word placed carefully. "It is about you." And I let that settle, not resisting it, not reacting to it, just allowing it to take its place among the other pieces that were already forming a pattern. And I thought about the questions Emily had asked me, about the timing of the sale, about the way this house had come into my life so easily, and I realized that what it seemed like coincidence was actually alignment, and alignment does not happen without planning. And I walked back to the desk, closing the laptop completely this time, as if sealing what I had already seen inside it. And I said, "Where do you want to meet?" and he gave me an address, a small office about 20 minutes away, a place that sounded ordinary, neutral, the kind of location chosen to avoid attention, and I repeated it back to him, committing it to memory. And then I asked one final question, not because I needed the answer, but because I wanted to hear how he would respond. And I said, "If I do not come." And there was no hesitation this time, no pause at all, just a simple, direct reply. "Then they will continue." And I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me, because that was all I needed to hear, not a threat, not a warning, just a statement of continuation. And continuation means something is already in motion. And I ended the call without another word, placing the phone gently on the desk. And for a moment, I stood there in the center of the room, the house quiet around me, the camera still in the wall, the footage still on the device, the truth no longer hidden but not yet complete. And I realized something then, something that felt less like fear and more like clarity, that I had not simply moved into this house. I had stepped into a situation that had been waiting for me. And the only question left was not whether I would go, but how I would choose to arrive. I did not rush to leave the house after the call ended, because rushing is what people expect when they think they have unsettled you. And I had no intention of giving anyone that satisfaction. So instead I walked upstairs, one slow step at a time, letting the house reveal itself again from a different perspective, not as a place I had just moved into, but as a place that had already been used, observed, and perhaps even prepared for me. And when I reached the bedroom, I paused in the doorway, taking in the neatly arranged furniture, the suitcase still half unpacked on the bench, the familiar objects from my old life placed carefully into a space that now felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something I had not agreed to. And I moved to the dresser, opening the top drawer where I had placed my documents earlier that morning, the closing papers, the bank statements, the notes I had made about my finances, all the things Emily had shown such interest in recently. And I sat down on the edge of the bed, pulling the folder onto my lap, flipping through the pages slowly, not searching for something specific, but allowing my memory to move alongside what I was seeing. And I began to recall the conversations I had dismissed at the time, the way Emily had asked about the timing of my sale, about whether I had considered renting instead of buying, about how quickly I had decided on this particular house, questions that had seemed practical, even helpful, but now felt structured, intentional, as if they had been guiding me toward a decision I believed was entirely my own. And I closed the folder gently, resting it beside me, and leaned back slightly, looking up at the ceiling, noticing for the first time how similar this room felt to the footage I had seen, the angles, the placement, the quiet familiarity of it all. And I wondered how many times this space had been observed before I ever placed my suitcase here. And more importantly, why? And I stood up again, walking over to the closet, opening the door, running my hand lightly along the hanging rail, the smooth wood, the empty space waiting to be filled, and I realized that this house had not been chosen for me because it was convenient or affordable or even well located. It had been chosen because it fit a plan that included me, my habits, my routines, my decisions. And I stepped back into the hallway, my movements calm, measured, the kind that comes when you are no longer reacting, but beginning to position yourself. And I made my way back downstairs, stopping briefly in the living room, my eyes settling once more on the small camera, embedded in the wall, still quiet, still watching. And I did not remove it, not yet, because removing it would signal awareness, and awareness, at this stage, was not something I intended to announce. So instead I turned away from it, walking into the kitchen, picking up my purse from the counter, checking its contents with deliberate care, my keys, my phone, a small notebook I had carried for years, the one Robert used to tease me about, because I preferred writing things down instead of relying on memory alone. And I slipped it into place, closing the clasp with a soft click. And I paused for a moment, my hand resting on the edge of the counter, looking around the room one last time, not with attachment, but with observation, noting the details, the arrangement, the quiet stillness that now felt less like peace and more like anticipation. And I realized something then, something that settled into me with a quiet certainty, that whatever had been set in motion here had expected me to arrive unprepared, to react emotionally, to follow a predictable path. And I had no intention of doing any of those things. So I picked up my phone again, not to call anyone, not to warn anyone, but simply to check the time, noting that it would take approximately 20 minutes to reach the address he had given me. 20 minutes that would allow me to consider not whether I would go, but how I would conduct myself when I arrived. And I walked to the front door, opening it slowly, the late afternoon air meeting me with a gentle warmth. The street still quiet, unchanged, as if nothing beneath the surface had shifted at all, and I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a soft, controlled motion. The sound final, but not dramatic, just another detail in a sequence that was becoming clearer with each passing moment. And as I walked toward my car, I thought about Robert, about the way he used to say that people reveal themselves not through what they hide, but through what they assume you will not notice. And I found myself appreciating that memory now more than ever, because it reminded me that observation is not passive, it is active, deliberate, and often underestimated. And I reached the driver's side door, unlocking it, sliding into the seat, placing my purse beside me. And I sat there for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my gaze steady. Not rushed, not uncertain, just focused, because I understood now that this meeting was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something that had already been carefully constructed, and the only variable that had not yet been accounted for was me. And as I finally started the engine and pulled away from the curb, merging into the quiet flow of the street, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath, not out of nerves, but out of recognition, because whatever I was about to walk into, I was no longer walking into it blindly, and that, more than anything, was where the balance began to shift. I drove the 20 minutes without turning on the radio, without checking my phone, without allowing anything to interrupt the steady line of thought that had begun forming the moment I saw Emily in that footage, because distraction has a way of weakening clarity, and clarity was the only advantage I had at this point. And as I followed the directions he had given me, the streets gradually shifted from quiet residential blocks to a more neutral part of town, small offices, modest storefronts, places designed to be overlooked rather than remembered. And when I finally pulled into the parking lot, I noticed how ordinary it all appeared. A single-story building with tinted windows, a small sign near the entrance that listed multiple businesses inside, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything out of the ordinary was happening within those walls. And I turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the building not for danger, but for detail, because detail is where intention hides. And I noted the lack of movement, the stillness of the windows, the absence of anyone entering or leaving. And I stepped out of the car, closing the door with the same quiet control I had maintained all afternoon, walking toward the entrance at an even pace, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. And when I reached the door, I paused briefly, not out of uncertainty, but to adjust my awareness. Because once I stepped inside, the situation would shift from observation to interaction, and interaction requires a different kind of attention. And I opened the door, stepping into a narrow hallway lined with plain walls and closed doors, the kind of space designed for privacy, for conversations that are not meant to be overheard. And at the end of the hallway, one door stood slightly ajar, and I knew without needing to be told that this was where I was expected to go, and I walked toward it, my footsteps soft against the carpet, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral. And when I reached the door, I pushed it open gently, and he was already there, seated behind a simple desk, his posture composed, his expression calm, as if he had been waiting not just for me to arrive, but for me to arrive exactly as I had, alone, composed, and aware. And he looked up at me, studying me for a brief moment before offering a small, almost respectful nod, and I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, not locking it, not making any unnecessary gestures, just allowing the room to settle into a quiet that felt different from the house, less observant, more contained. And I took the chair across from him without being invited, because invitation implies authority, and I had no intention of granting him that. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us not as tension, but as acknowledgement. Two people aware that the conversation about to begin had already been in motion long before this meeting. And finally he said, "You found the footage," and I nodded once, not elaborating, not offering more than necessary. And he watched me carefully, as if measuring not just what I said, but what I chose not to say. And then he leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands folding together in front of him, and he said, "Then you know this was never about the house." And I met his gaze steadily, not challenging, not yielding, just present, and I replied, "I know it involves me." And there was a faint shift in his expression, something that suggested approval, or perhaps recognition, and he said, "Yes." And for a moment he seemed to consider how to proceed, as if weighing how much to reveal and how much to hold back, and I let him take that time, because people reveal more when they believe they are in control of the pacing. And after a few seconds he continued, "She approached me 6 months ago, and I did not need to ask who he meant, because there was only one person who fit into the pattern I had already seen." And he went on, "She was very specific about what she needed." And I listened without interruption, my hands resting loosely in my lap, my posture unchanged, and he added, "Access, mostly, and documentation." And I let that word settle, documentation, because it suggested something more structured than simple observation, something recorded, organized, perhaps even intended for a purpose beyond curiosity. And I said, "And you agreed?" And he nodded, not defensively, not apologetically, just factually, and replied, "I provided what she requested." And there was no attempt to justify it, no attempt to soften it, just a statement of action, and I found that useful, because it removed any ambiguity about his role in this. And I asked, "And the house?" And he glanced briefly toward the door before looking back at me, as if acknowledging the larger context without needing to explain it. And he said, "The house made it easier." And I considered that, not rushing to interpret it, but allowing it to align with what I had already observed, the timing, the sale, the way everything had come together without resistance. And I said, "You sold it to me knowing she was involved." And he nodded again, and for the first time there was a slight shift in his posture, not discomfort, but something closer to resignation, and he said, "I sold it because she wanted you here." And that was the moment everything narrowed into focus, not expanding outward, but drawing inward, concentrating into a single, clear understanding. And I sat there, looking at him, not with anger, not with shock, but with a quiet, steady awareness that the situation I had stepped into was not random, not accidental, but designed. And I asked, "Why?" And this time he did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he understood the weight of the question. And after a moment he said, "Because what she needs cannot be taken directly." And I felt a small shift in my chest, not fear, not alarm, but recognition, because that sentence carried more meaning than it revealed. And I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, my tone even, and I said, "Then it has to be given." And he met my gaze, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in his expression, something that confirmed what I had just said was not speculation, but truth. And he nodded slowly, and said, "Yes." And in that moment I understood, not just the situation, but the structure of it, the way it had been built around me, not to force, but to influence, to guide, to shape decisions that would appear to be my own. And I sat back again, letting the silence return, not empty, but full. And I realized that whatever came next would not depend on what he said, but on what I chose to do with what I now knew. He did not say anything else after that, and I did not press him for more, because there are moments when pushing for additional answers only gives the other person time to reshape the truth. And I had already gathered what I needed from the way he chose his words, from what he avoided, from what he confirmed without resistance. And I sat there for a few seconds longer, letting the silence settle into something final, something that marked the end of this part of the conversation. And then I stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with the same calm control I had maintained since I walked into that office. And he watched me as I did, his expression unreadable but attentive, as if he was trying to determine whether I would react in a way that matched whatever expectation had been placed on me before I arrived. And I reached for my purse, lifting it from the chair beside me, and I said, "You have already given me enough." And he did not argue, did not attempt to stop me, just nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging that whatever role he had played in this situation had reached its limit. And I turned toward the door, opening it without hesitation, stepping back into the hallway, the quiet of that narrow space feeling different now, not unfamiliar, but no longer neutral. And as I walked back toward the exit, I thought about what he had said, about the structure of it, about the way everything pointed not to an immediate action, but to a gradual process, something designed to unfold over time rather than all at once. And I stepped outside into the late afternoon light again. The air slightly cooler now, the shadows longer, and I made my way back to my car, my movements steady, my thoughts aligned, not scattered, not overwhelmed, just organized. Because once you understand the intention behind something, the details begin to arrange themselves naturally. And I got into the driver's seat, closing the door behind me. And for a moment, I did not start the engine. I simply sat there, looking out at the building, at the quiet parking lot, at the stillness that had seemed so ordinary when I arrived. And I realized that nothing about this had been ordinary. Not the call, not the camera, not the footage, not even the house itself. Everything had been placed, timed, structured. And I allowed myself a slow breath, not to calm down, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. Because this was no longer a situation I was trying to understand. It was a situation I now understood well enough to respond to. And I started the engine, pulling out of the parking lot with the same controlled pace, merging back onto the road. And as I drove, I began to think not about what had already happened, but about what would happen next, about how Emily would expect this to unfold, about the assumptions she had likely made about my behavior, my reactions, my decisions, and I considered each of them carefully, not to confirm them, but to understand how they could be used, because expectation, when properly observed, becomes predictable, and predictability creates opportunity. And I thought about the house again, about the camera still embedded in the wall, about the footage still stored on that device, about the way everything had been left in place, not hidden well enough to remain undiscovered, but not obvious enough to be noticed immediately. And I understood then that the camera was not just a tool for observation. It was a measure, a way to track how long it would take me to become aware, how I would react once I did, whether I would remove it, ignore it, or follow the path that had been subtly laid out for me. And I found that detail particularly useful, because it meant that my actions from this point forward would not just affect the outcome. They would be observed as part of the process. And I turned onto my street, the familiar row of houses coming into view, each one quiet, unchanged, as if nothing beneath the surface had shifted at all. And I pulled into my driveway, turning off the engine, sitting there for a moment before stepping out. And when I walked up to the front door, I did not hesitate. I did not pause. I simply unlocked it and stepped inside, closing it behind me with the same quiet precision as before. And the house greeted me with the same stillness, the same carefully arranged space, the same small camera in the wall that I had not yet removed. And I walked into the living room, standing in the center of it, looking directly at that lens for the first time since I had discovered it. Not with curiosity, not with discomfort, but with intention, because now I understood what it represented, not just surveillance, but a connection, a line between what was happening here and whoever believed they were watching from the other side. And I remained there for a few seconds, letting that awareness settle, letting the silence hold its shape. And then I turned away, not because I was ignoring it, but because I had already decided what role it would play in what came next. And I walked to the desk, opening my laptop again, not to review the footage this time, but to begin organizing what I knew, the dates, the patterns, the sequence of events that had led me here. And I took out my notebook, opening it to a blank page, writing down the key details in a clear, steady hand, not rushing, not skipping anything, because clarity on paper creates clarity in action. And as I wrote, I realized something that settled into me with a quiet certainty, that whatever Emily had planned, whatever outcome she had expected, it depended on one assumption, that I would remain unaware long enough for her plan to complete itself. And that assumption was no longer valid. And as I closed the notebook, placing the pen carefully beside it, I looked around the room once more, not as someone who had just moved in, but as someone who now understood exactly where she was standing. And for the first time since the phone had rung that afternoon, I allowed myself a small, controlled shift in perspective, not as a participant in someone else's design, but as someone who had just stepped into a position where the next move would be entirely her own. That evening, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I allowed myself to follow a routine exactly as it appeared, without altering it, without adding any visible change, because if someone was watching, and I now had every reason to believe they were, then consistency would be more revealing than confrontation, and I moved through the house as if nothing had shifted, setting my purse on the counter, turning on the kitchen light, opening the refrigerator, taking out the same ingredients I had planned to use earlier, preparing a simple dinner with steady, unhurried movements. And I was careful not to glance toward the camera again, not to acknowledge it in any obvious way, because awareness, when revealed too soon, becomes a signal, and I had no intention of sending any signals yet. And as I moved through each small task, I paid attention not just to what I was doing, but to how it might appear from the perspective of someone observing from a distance, someone expecting me to behave in a certain way, someone waiting to see whether I would notice, react, or ignore. And I chose to give them exactly what they expected, at least for now, because expectation creates comfort, and comfort lowers caution. And after dinner, I carried my plate to the sink, rinsed it, placed it neatly in the rack, wiped the counter, turned off the lights. Each action measured, ordinary, consistent with the version of myself they believed they understood. And then I walked into the living room, picking up a book from one of the boxes I had unpacked earlier, sitting down in the chair near the window, positioning myself in a way that felt natural, but also deliberate, because I wanted to see how much of the room the camera could capture, how wide its angle might be. And I opened the book, letting my eyes move across the page, not truly reading, but allowing my posture and stillness to communicate something simple, something predictable. And as the minutes passed, I found myself thinking not about the words in front of me, but about the structure of what I had uncovered, about the way Emily had positioned herself within my life over the past year, about the gradual shift from casual conversation to more focused questions, about the timing of my decision to sell the house, the encouragement she had offered, the reassurance that this move would be better for me, easier, more manageable. And I realized that none of it had been forced, none of it had been direct. It had all been suggested, guided, shaped in a way that allowed me to believe every decision was entirely my own. And that was the most important detail of all, because it meant that whatever she was planning depended on my continued participation, my willingness to follow the path she had created. And I closed the book slowly, resting it on my lap, my gaze shifting briefly toward the wall where the camera remained, still quiet, still present. And I allowed myself a single glance, just enough to confirm its position, its angle, its subtle presence within the room. And then I looked away again, because I did not need to observe it any longer. I needed to understand how it was being used. And I stood up, stretching slightly, as if responding to the natural rhythm of the evening, and I walked toward the hallway, turning off the living room light, leaving the house dim but not dark, the kind of lighting that suggests normalcy, routine, the end of a quiet day. And I made my way upstairs, entering the bedroom, closing the door behind me, not fully, just enough to create the impression of privacy without completely removing visibility. And I sat down at the edge of the bed, removing my shoes, placing them neatly beside it. And for a moment, I simply sat there, my hands resting in my lap, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, because this was the part of the evening where patterns become most predictable, where people assume nothing of importance is happening. And that assumption, I realized, was exactly where I needed to be. And I reached for my notebook again, opening it quietly, writing down a few additional observations, not large conclusions, just small details, the time of the call, the exact wording he had used, the sequence of events that had followed, because memory, while reliable, becomes stronger when it is recorded. And I closed the notebook again, placing it inside the drawer beside the bed, out of immediate sight but not hidden, just stored. And I leaned back slightly, looking up at the ceiling, allowing my breathing to slow, not out of fatigue, but out of control, because everything from this point forward would depend on maintaining that control, on continuing to appear exactly as expected while preparing for what would come next. And as I turned off the bedside lamp, letting the room fall into a soft, even darkness, I realized something that felt both simple and significant, that the person watching this house believed they were observing me. But observation without understanding is incomplete, and I now understood far more than they expected. And that difference, small as it seemed, was enough to begin changing the outcome in ways they had not planned for. The next morning, I woke up at exactly 6:30 without needing an alarm, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had remained active even in rest, quietly arranging everything I had learned into something usable, something precise, and I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house, and I realized it felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because understanding alters perception in ways that cannot be reversed, and I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor, moving through the familiar motions of the morning with the same consistency I had maintained the night before, because routine, when observed, becomes a message, and I intended to keep that message steady, predictable, unremarkable, and I made my way downstairs, turning on the kitchen light, starting the coffee maker, opening the refrigerator, preparing breakfast in the same measured way, each action deliberate, each movement aligned with the version of myself they believed they were watching. And as I stood at the counter, waiting for the coffee to finish, I allowed my thoughts to move forward, not backward, not revisiting what had already been confirmed, but focusing on what had not yet been revealed, because there was still something missing, something that had not yet fully surfaced, and I poured the coffee into a mug, carrying it into the living room, sitting down in the same chair near the window, positioning myself again within the likely frame of the camera, and I took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle, not rushing, not reacting, just maintaining the pattern, and after a few minutes, I stood up, placing the mug on the table, walking toward the wall where the camera was embedded, and this time, instead of ignoring it, I stopped directly in front of it, not too close, not too obvious, just within its view, and I adjusted a small picture frame beside it, a simple, ordinary action, but one that allowed me to confirm something important, the angle, the reach, the precise area it covered, and as I stepped back, I realized the camera captured more than just the living room. It extended slightly into the hallway, enough to track movement between spaces, enough to observe patterns over time, and I nodded slightly, not to anyone, just to myself, because that detail mattered. And I turned away again, continuing with my morning as if nothing had changed, finishing my coffee, rinsing the mug, placing it in the sink, and then I did something different, something small, something that would not disrupt the pattern but would begin to test it. I left the house, locking the door behind me, walking to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, something I had not done the previous day, something that introduced a minor variation, and as I stood there, sorting through the envelopes, I glanced briefly toward the house, toward the window that faced the living room, and I wondered not if I was being watched, but how closely, how attentively, whether small changes like this would be noticed, recorded, analyzed, and I returned inside after a few minutes, placing the mail on the counter, opening one envelope, then another, moving through the motions casually, naturally, and then I paused, not because something unexpected had happened, but because I felt something shift, not in the house, but in the rhythm of it, a subtle awareness that comes when you are no longer just being observed, but being assessed. And I walked into the living room again, picking up the book from the night before, sitting down, opening it, letting my eyes scan the page, and I allowed a few minutes to pass before closing it again, standing up, stretching slightly, and then I walked over to the desk, opening my laptop, not to review the footage, but to create something new, a simple document, a timeline, a structure that would allow me to track not just what had happened, but what would happen next, and I began typing. The sound of the keys soft but steady, recording the details, the call, the camera, the meeting, the confirmation, each element placed in order, each piece connected, and as I worked, I realized that what I was doing was not just organizing information, I was building a response, not reactive, not emotional, but strategic, something that would align with the pattern already in place while quietly redirecting it. And I paused for a moment, my fingers resting on the keyboard, thinking about Emily, about the way she had positioned herself within this structure, about how confident she must have been in the plan she had set in motion. And I found myself wondering not what she expected me to do, but what she would do if those expectations were not met. And that question stayed with me as I closed the laptop, standing up, walking back toward the center of the room, and I looked once more at the camera, not directly, not obviously, just enough to acknowledge its presence without revealing my awareness. And I understood then that the next step would not be about uncovering more information. It would be about allowing them to believe everything was still proceeding exactly as planned, because only then would they continue, and only by continuing would they reveal what they had not yet shown, and as I turned away, moving back into the quiet rhythm of the morning, I realized that whatever came next would not be initiated by me, it would be triggered by them, and I intended to be ready when it did. By mid-afternoon, the house had settled into a rhythm that felt almost too smooth, too consistent, like a performance that had been rehearsed long before I arrived. And I began to notice something subtle but important, not in what I saw, but in what I did not see, because patterns are not only revealed by repetition, they are revealed by absence. And as I moved through the rooms, opening a cabinet here, adjusting a curtain there, I realized that no new anomalies had appeared, no unexpected sounds, no misplaced objects, nothing that suggested immediate interference, and that in itself was a signal. Because if someone had gone to the trouble of setting up a system to observe me, they were not doing it passively. They were waiting, watching, measuring, and I began to consider what they might be waiting for, what action or decision from me would trigger the next phase of whatever this was. And I returned to the desk, opening my laptop again, this time selecting a different set of video files, not the most recent ones, but those from the earliest dates available, because beginnings often reveal intentions more clearly than outcomes. And as the footage loaded, I leaned slightly closer to the screen, my eyes steady, my breathing even, and the image appeared, the house in its earlier state, emptier, less furnished, but already prepared in ways I had not noticed before. And then she appeared again, Emily, moving through the space with the same quiet confidence, but this time, she was not alone. There was another figure partially visible, someone standing just outside the main frame, speaking softly, their voice too faint to distinguish, but their presence undeniable, and I adjusted the volume, not expecting clarity, but hoping for tone, for rhythm, for something that might suggest familiarity, and I listened carefully, not straining, just allowing the sound to come through naturally, and there it was. Not the words, but the cadence, the pacing, the subtle pattern of speech that felt familiar in a way that was difficult to place at first, and I sat back slightly, letting that recognition settle, because it was not immediate, not obvious, but it was there, and I closed my eyes for a brief moment, replaying the sound in my mind, comparing it to recent conversations, to voices I had heard in my own home, at my own table, and when I opened my eyes again, the connection formed quietly, not with shock, but with a kind of steady confirmation, because I had heard that voice before, not often, not directly, but enough to recognize its rhythm, its careful tone, its measured way of speaking, and I reached for my notebook, writing down a single line, not a name, not a conclusion, just a note about the voice, about the pattern, about the possibility, because speculation without structure leads nowhere, and I returned my attention to the screen, watching as Emily moved closer to the camera, pointing toward a section of the wall, indicating something specific, something intentional, and I realized that the placement of the camera had not been arbitrary. It had been chosen, positioned to capture exactly what they needed, nothing more, nothing less, and I clicked forward through the footage, watching the sequence unfold, noting the consistency, the repetition, the way each action seemed to build on the last, and then I saw something that made me pause. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Emily, standing in the living room, holding a set of documents, reviewing them briefly before placing them on the desk, the same desk now sitting in my home, the same surface where I had been organizing my own papers just hours ago, and I leaned closer again, studying the image, the angle, the details, and I realized that those documents were not random. They were structured, formatted, similar to the ones I had signed during the purchase, and I felt a small shift in my understanding, not a change, but an expansion, because this was not just about observing me. It was about aligning me with something that had already been prepared, something that had been placed within reach, waiting for me to interact with it in a way that would appear natural, voluntary, and I closed the video slowly, my hand resting on the edge of the laptop, my gaze unfocused for a moment as I allowed everything to settle into place, and I realized that what I was dealing with was not a single action, not a single plan, but a sequence, a progression designed to guide me from one decision to the next without ever making the influence visible. And I stood up, walking slowly into the living room, my eyes moving across the space. Not searching, but observing, and I stopped near the desk, looking down at its surface, at the place where I had placed my own documents earlier, and I imagined for a moment how it would appear from the camera's perspective, how my actions would be interpreted, recorded, perhaps even analyzed, and I understood then that the next step would not come from them directly. It would come from something already placed within my environment, something designed to prompt a response, to initiate the next phase without direct contact, and I turned slightly, my gaze drifting toward the hallway, the subtle extension of the camera's reach, and I realized that movement, timing, sequence, all of it was being tracked, and I allowed myself a slow breath, not out of tension, but out of clarity, because the structure was no longer hidden, it was visible, and once something becomes visible, it can be navigated. And as I stood there in the quiet of the room, the house around me unchanged, the camera still, silent, the air still, I understood that whatever they had planned next was already in place, waiting, and the only question that remained was not whether it would happen, but when I would choose to let it unfold. That realization stayed with me as the afternoon stretched into early evening, not as a source of pressure, but as a point of control, because once you understand that something has already been set in motion, you stop waiting for it and start watching for where it will surface. And I moved through the house again, slower this time, more deliberate, not searching, but allowing my attention to rest on the spaces that had previously felt ordinary, because those are the places where carefully placed details tend to hide. And I walked into the hallway, pausing briefly where the camera's angle extended just enough to capture movement between rooms, and I turned slightly, aligning myself with that invisible line of observation, and I thought about timing, about how long it had been since I returned from the meeting, about how long it might take for someone on the other side of that lens to process what they had seen, to adjust, to initiate whatever came next, and I continued. Into the living room, my eyes moving across the desk again, across the surface where I had placed my notebook, my laptop, my documents, and something about the arrangement felt just slightly off, not wrong, but not exactly as I had left it either, and I stepped closer, my movements calm, my breathing steady, and I noticed it then, not immediately obvious, but present once I allowed myself to see it, a single envelope, placed neatly beside my notebook, an envelope I did not remember bringing in, did not remember placing there, and I stood there for a moment, not touching it, not reacting, just observing, because the appearance of something new within a controlled environment is never accidental, it is intentional, and I considered the possibilities, not in a scattered way, but in a structured one, how it might have been placed there, when it might have appeared, whether it had been delivered while I was out, or whether it had been there all along, positioned in a way that I would only notice it at this exact moment. And I reached out slowly, picking it up between my fingers, feeling its weight, its texture, the slight stiffness of the paper, and I turned it over, noting that there was no name on the front, no address, nothing to indicate origin, just a plain, sealed envelope, and I did not open it immediately, because opening something too quickly reveals more about you than it does about the object itself, and I placed it back down on the desk, stepping back slightly, allowing myself to think, to align this new element with everything I had already uncovered, and I realized that this was the next step, not initiated through a phone call, not delivered through conversation, but placed quietly within my space, designed to prompt an action, a decision, something that could be observed, measured, and I understood then that whatever was inside that envelope was not just information, it was a test, and I turned away from the desk, walking slowly toward the kitchen, giving myself distance from it, not out of avoidance, but out of control, because distance allows clarity. And I poured myself another glass of water, taking a slow sip, letting the quiet of the house settle. Again, and I thought about Emily, about the structure of her approach, about how everything had been designed to feel natural, unforced, how each step had been introduced in a way that aligned with my own behavior, my own decisions, and I realized that this envelope would be no different. It would contain something that appeared reasonable, something that made sense within the context of my current situation, something that would encourage me to act in a way that seemed entirely my own, and I set the glass down, turning back toward the living room, my pace unchanged, my posture steady, and I approached the desk again, this time without hesitation, because hesitation would serve no purpose now, and I picked up the envelope once more, holding it in both hands, feeling the slight resistance of the sealed edge, and I opened it carefully, not tearing it, just sliding my finger along the fold, allowing it to open cleanly. And inside there was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded, and I unfolded it slowly, my eyes moving across the surface, taking in the contents not with surprise, but with recognition, because the document was structured in a way that felt familiar. A form, a proposal, something related to property, to ownership, to transfer, written in language that was clear but deliberate. And as I read, I understood exactly what it was asking, not directly, not aggressively, but subtly, presenting an option, a suggestion, something that would appear beneficial, convenient, aligned with my needs. And I felt that same quiet shift again, not in my emotions, but in my understanding, because this was the mechanism. This was how the plan moved forward, not through force, but through invitation, through the careful placement of choices that seemed to originate from me. And I lowered the paper slightly, looking at it again, not for what it said, but for what it represented, and I realized that everything had led to this moment. The camera, the footage, the meeting, all of it designed to guide me here, to this decision point. And I placed the paper back on the desk, not signing it, not rejecting it, just leaving it there, exactly where it had been found, and I stepped back, my gaze drifting briefly toward the camera on the wall. And for a fraction of a second, I allowed myself to meet it directly, not long enough to signal awareness, but long enough to acknowledge its presence, because now I understood that this was no longer about discovering what they had planned. It was about deciding how I would respond to it. And as I turned away, the house settling around me once more, the envelope open on the desk, the camera silent, I knew that the next move would not come from them. It would come from me, and that was something they had not accounted for. That night, I did not touch the document again, not because I was avoiding it, but because I understood that its presence alone was already part of the process, and reacting too quickly would only confirm what they were waiting to see. So I left it exactly where it was, unfolded, visible, as if I had simply paused in the middle of reading it and would return at any moment. And I moved through the rest of the evening with the same quiet consistency I had established, preparing a simple dinner, cleaning the kitchen, sitting briefly in the living room with a book I did not actually read, allowing the rhythm of normal life to continue uninterrupted. And as the hours passed, I began to notice something subtle in my own awareness, a shift from observation to anticipation, not in a tense or anxious way, but in a structured, deliberate one, because I now understood that every action I took, every delay, every choice not to act, was being interpreted, measured against whatever expectation had been built around me. And I was no longer simply responding to a situation, I was shaping how that situation unfolded. And as I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs, I thought about the document again, about the language it used, about how carefully it had been constructed to feel reasonable, beneficial, aligned with my circumstances, and I realized that its true purpose was not to convince me, but to confirm me, to see whether I would follow the path it presented without resistance. And that distinction mattered, because confirmation requires consistency, and consistency can be influenced. And I entered the bedroom, closing the door softly behind me, sitting on the edge of the bed for a moment, my hands resting loosely in my lap, my posture relaxed, and I allowed myself to think not about the document itself, but about the response it would generate on the other side of the camera, because by now I was certain that someone was watching, not constantly perhaps, but regularly, reviewing, analyzing, and I considered how they might interpret my behavior so far. No immediate reaction, no removal of the camera, no confrontation, just quiet continuation, and I understood that this would create a certain expectation, a belief that I was either unaware or unwilling to challenge what had been placed in front of me, and that belief, I realized, was exactly what I needed to maintain, at least for now. And I lay down slowly, turning off the bedside lamp, letting the room fall into darkness once again, and I closed my eyes, not to sleep immediately, but to allow my thoughts to settle into a clear sequence, because what would happen next would depend on how convincingly I could remain within the role they had assigned to me. And the following morning, I woke at the same time as before, moving through the same routine, preparing coffee, sitting in the same chair, allowing the pattern to continue. And after a few minutes, I stood up, walking toward the desk with a calm, unhurried pace, and I paused there, looking at the document as if I were seeing it again for the first time. Picking it up slowly, reading through it once more, my expression neutral, my posture relaxed, and I let a few minutes pass, long enough to suggest consideration, long enough to appear thoughtful but not resistant. And then I reached for a pen, holding it between my fingers, not writing immediately, just resting it lightly against the paper, as if weighing the decision, and I allowed a small pause, just enough to create the impression of hesitation, because hesitation, when observed, reinforces authenticity. And then I made a simple mark, not a signature, not a commitment, just a small notation in the margin, something that suggested engagement without completion, and I placed the pen down, folding the document carefully, placing it back into the envelope, and setting it on the desk once more, this time slightly shifted from its original position, as if it had been handled, considered, but not finalized, and I stepped back, my gaze moving briefly toward the camera, not directly, just within its range, and I understood that this small action would be seen, interpreted, analyzed, and most importantly, it would signal that the process was moving forward, that I was following the path, even if only partially, and I turned away, continuing with the rest of my morning, leaving the house briefly again, returning with the mail, maintaining the same pattern of normalcy, and as the day progressed, I remained aware of the subtle tension beneath the surface, not in the house itself, but in the structure of what was unfolding, because by now I knew that my actions were not just being observed. They were being used to determine the next step, and that realization did not create uncertainty. It created clarity, because it meant that whatever came next would not be random. It would be a direct response to what I had just done. And as I stood in the living room later that afternoon, the light shifting through the window, the house quiet, the camera still in place, I felt that same steady awareness settle over me again, not as pressure, but as control, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting to what had been set in motion, I was influencing it, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything. The shift came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but once it happened, I knew immediately that something had changed, not in the house, not in the camera, but in the pattern itself, and I was standing in the living room when it occurred, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor in long, soft lines, the envelope still resting on the desk exactly where I had left it, slightly moved, slightly handled, just enough to suggest progress without commitment, and I felt it before I saw it. That subtle sense of adjustment, the kind that happens when someone on the other side of a system makes a decision, and I did not move right away. I did not react. I simply stood there, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because whatever was coming next would reveal more if I did not disrupt it. And after a few seconds, I turned slowly toward the hallway, my gaze drifting naturally, not searching, just observing. And that was when I noticed it. Not dramatic, not obvious, but new. A small change near the base of the wall just beyond the camera's reach, something that had not been there before, and I walked toward it at the same measured pace, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral. And as I got closer, I saw that it was another device, smaller than the first, more discreet, positioned lower, angled differently, and I paused for a moment, not touching it, just studying its placement, its intention, and I understood immediately what it meant. This was not a continuation of the same observation. This was an adjustment, a refinement, a response to what I had done, and I allowed myself a slow breath, not out of surprise, but out of recognition, because this confirmed everything I had already concluded, that my actions were being monitored not just for awareness, but for progression, for compliance, for alignment with a plan that was still unfolding, and I turned slightly, my eyes moving back toward the desk, toward the envelope, toward the document that had been left for me, and I saw the connection clearly now, the partial engagement, the mark I had made, the pause instead of the signature, all of it, had signaled something specific, something that required a response, and this new device was that response, not an escalation, not a threat, but a recalibration, a way to capture more detail, more movement, more nuance in how I interacted with what had been placed before me, and I stepped back slowly, not removing it, not acknowledging it directly, just allowing it to remain exactly as it was, because its presence was more valuable to me than its absence. And I walked back into the living room, sitting down in the same chair near the window, picking up the book again, opening it to the same page, allowing the appearance of routine to continue uninterrupted. And as I sat there, I let my thoughts settle into a clear, steady line. Because this was the moment where everything aligned, not in a dramatic way, but in a precise one. The camera, the footage, the meeting, the document, the adjustment, all of it forming a complete structure that no longer needed to be questioned, only navigated. And I realized then that the outcome they were expecting depended entirely on one final step, not immediate, not forced, but inevitable, a decision that I would appear to make on my own, a conclusion. That would seem natural after everything that had been presented, and I closed the book slowly, placing it on the table beside me, and I stood up, walking toward the desk with the same calm, deliberate pace, my hand reaching for the envelope once more, lifting it, opening it again, reading the document as if for the first time, my expression thoughtful, my posture composed, and I let a few seconds pass, just enough to reinforce the pattern, just enough to suggest that I had reached the point they had been guiding me toward, and I picked up the pen again, holding it lightly between my fingers, and this time, I did not pause, I did not hesitate. I placed the tip against the paper and signed my name in a smooth, controlled motion, not rushed, not forced, just steady, and I set the pen down, folding the document carefully, placing it back into the envelope, and setting it on the desk, exactly where it had been before, and I stepped back, my gaze drifting briefly toward the wall, toward both devices now, the original camera and the new one, both silent, both present, both recording, and for a moment, I allowed myself to stand there without movement, without expression, just still, because this was the point where they would believe the process was complete, that the outcome had been achieved, that I had followed the path exactly as intended, and I turned away, walking slowly toward the kitchen, pouring myself another glass of water, taking a small sip, my movements unchanged, my routine intact, and I understood something then, something that settled into me with a quiet certainty, that they believed they had guided me to this moment, that every step had led here, to this decision, this signature, this conclusion. But what they did not know, what they had never accounted for, was that understanding changes the meaning of every action. And as I set the glass down, my reflection faintly visible in the window, I realized that I had not followed their plan. I had stepped into it, observed it, and chosen exactly where to appear to comply, and where to begin rewriting it. And the signature on that paper was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something they had not yet seen, because the only thing more powerful than being watched is knowing exactly who is watching you, and deciding when to let them believe they have already won.